it's essentially a measure of how much somebody's willing to wait to get an reward. So let's say I offer you $100. If you have a choice between taking that $100 now and waiting a year for the $100, you'd probably take it now. Most people would, and that's, I guess, how banks make money, based on the fact that a future reward is worth less than an immediate one. So by offering people choices between different size rewards at different points in time, you can actually quantify how much someone is willing to wait. So let's say you increase the $100 in a year's time to $120 or $150. There'll come a point at which you're willing to wait. By offering a bunch of those choices, you can plot a curve that describes how the value of money goes down the longer you have to wait for it. And for different people, that curve it varies in how steep it is. So a steeper curve means you're more impatient or less willing to wait. That's known as steeper delay discounting. And there's reason to think this might be relevant for antidepressant discontinuation or depressive relapse. So firstly, there's some evidence linking delay discounting with depression. So we know that people with a history of depression tend to be more impatient for rewards. And then secondly, the sort of fairly separate line of evidence that links discounting to changes in serotonin function. The most reliable evidence for that comes from animal studies where lesioning parts of the brain that have most of the serotonergic injections causes animals to be much more impatient to get rewards. Similarly, stimulating those neurons means that the animal's more willing to wait. So taking all this together, we had two predictions, really. One was that discounting itself might be a marker of vulnerability to future depression, and might therefore predict relapse. So we thought that people that were more impatient at baseline might be more likely to go on to relapse. Secondly, we thought discounting might be a marker of a discontinuation syndrome. So sort of in broad brush terms, the idea here is that some people who stop their antidepressants might experience a reduction in serotonin. Come back to what the evidence for that is, but the idea is if you had a greater reduction in serotonin, you might experience a greater increase in delay discounting. Not sort of early increase in discounting or impulsivity might predict go in relapse. But those were our hypotheses anyway. So traditionally, I guess that, if you look at clinical guidelines and things, prediction of depressive relapse is mainly based on the clinical characteristics of depression, usually over the course of someone's life. The most reliable predictor being the number of previous episodes of depression. So more than one episode of depression, for example, you're more likely to relapse than if you just have one episode. There are other clinical markers like residual symptoms that people have, residual symptoms of depression. So they may be sub-threshold for depression, but they still have some ongoing symptoms, and that can be used to predict future relapse. Discounting is different because it's not, strictly a clinical measure of somebody's kind of the natural history of someone's depression. It's more of a snapshot behavioral marker. So you can think of it as a way of kind of assaying at a particular point in time how somebody's making decisions in relation to reward. In some ways, you could say that's more objective. It's harder to second guess than some subjective report measures. Some of these other measures, like number of previous episodes, are quite objective, but nevertheless can sometimes be quite difficult to pin down clinically. So we found that patients with remitted depression were less willing to wait for a reward than the healthy controls at baseline. So in technical terms, that means they have steeper discounting. The curve by which the value of money goes down over time is steeper amongst people with remitted depression. It's a fairly small effect in some ways. So to give you an idea of that, in the remitted depression group, if the average patient, as it were, if they were offered a reward of 75 euros in 3 weeks' time, they would be willing to knock that down to 66 euros in order to have it straight away. So they'd take a 66 euros now rather than 75 in 3 weeks' time, whereas the controls would only knock it down to 70 euros. So, it might sound like a small difference, but I guess over time, those sorts of, repeating those choices, your remitted depressive patients would lose some money.